He thought he was just honoring his late father by hauling one last load in an old rig. But when the army demanded to know who was behind the wheel, and a 4-star general appeared at the funeral, Dylan uncovered a secret legacy his dad had kept hidden for decades. What kind of man had his father really been? The smell of motor oil lingered in the garage long after the tools had been laid down for good. Dylan Mercer stood in the dim light of his father's workshop, the place where he had spent most of his childhood waiting for Gus to finish patching up another old truck. The wooden workbench was scarred with decades of use, its surface nicked by screwdrivers and stained with grease. A half-drained coffee cup sat on the corner, untouched since the week Gus had gone into the hospital. Dylan picked it up, turned it in his hands, and set it back down. His throat tightened. The silence in here was louder than the clang of wrenches ever had been. Gus Mercer had been more than a father. He'd been the backbone of this truck stop community. To the drivers who rolled in from the interstate, Gus was the guy who could fix anything. To Dylan, he was just Dad. Patient, stubborn, sometimes gruff, but always steady. When the cancer took him after months of slow decline, Dylan thought he was prepared. He wasn't. At 25, Dylan had no clear path forward. He tried college and dropped out, worked odd jobs that never stuck, and now found himself standing in a shop that felt more like a shrine than a workplace. Everyone at the diner next door told him not to blame himself, that his father had been proud of him regardless. But Dylan couldn't shake the guilt of never really learning the trade, never really stepping into Gus's shoes. That night, after sorting through papers and boxes, Dylan found the keys to his father's rig, an old Kenworth, paint faded and chrome dulled by time. He ran his fingers over the steering wheel, remembering sitting up front as a boy when Gus let him ride along on short hauls. The smell of diesel, the hum of the engine, his father's hand on the gearshift, those were the memories that made him feel safe. Some nights, when the highway stretched quiet, Gus would switch on the CB radio and let Dylan listen. Voices crackled in and out, truckers swapping road stories, soldiers passing coded chatter. Gus would wink and whisper, "Every voice has a journey, son. You just have to tune in." Dylan never forgot the sound of that static, or how his father's world seemed bigger than the garage walls. Now, staring at the logbook tucked into the dash, Dylan felt an idea rising in his chest. He couldn't fix engines like Gus. He couldn't rebuild carburetors blindfolded or diagnose a failing transmission by ear. But maybe he could do one last run in his father's honor. Just one. Close the chapter the way Gus would have wanted, behind the wheel hauling freight. The job practically offered itself. Parked in the corner of the lot was a trailer already loaded and waiting, a short contract Gus had taken before getting too sick to drive. The manifest inside was simple: automotive parts, destination listed on a printout that looked official but vague. Dylan told himself it was no different from any of the loads he'd seen come and go. A short haul, finish what Gus started, then park the rig for good. When he told Marlene, the diner waitress who had known him since high school, she stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You haven't driven a load in your life, Dylan." She wiped her hands on her apron and shook her head. "That's a big rig, not your dad's pickup. You sure you know what you're doing?" "I'm not trying to make a career out of it," he replied, a little defensively. "It's just one last trip. For him." She sighed, her eyes softening. "Then at least promise me you'll be careful. You don't honor a man by joining him too soon." By dawn, Dylan was climbing into the cab. The seat felt too big, the mirrors too wide, the controls overwhelming. His hands trembled as he turned the ignition. The W900 roared to life, rattling deep in his chest. For a moment, he almost climbed back out. But then he thought of Gus, late nights hunched under hoods, never once walking away from a job that needed doing. Dylan pulled out of the lot. The highway stretched before him like a ribbon of uncertainty. With every mile marker, memories surfaced. Gus teaching him how to check oil with a rag. Gus laughing when Dylan spilled a quart of transmission fluid across the shop floor. Gus staying late to fix a stranger's truck for free because a man's got to get home to his family. Dylan had seen kindness in his father's work, but he had never understood the weight of it until now. At a rest stop, Dylan pulled over to catch his breath. The manifest on the passenger seat caught his eye again. It wasn't handwritten like most small contracts Gus took. It was typed, stamped, almost military in its precision. He shrugged it off, telling himself he was just nervous, but a knot settled in his stomach. An older trucker parked beside him leaned out the window and gave a nod. "That's Gus's rig, isn't it?" the man called. Dylan looked up, surprised. "Yeah, you knew him." "Who didn't?" the man chuckled. "Your old man patched me up more times than I can count. Never asked for much. Just a handshake and a story." He paused, eyes narrowing. "Good man. Some folks say he did more than most of us ever knew." Dylan forced a smile, thanked him, and climbed back into the cab. But the words echoed long after he pulled back onto the highway. More than most of us ever knew. As dusk approached, the delivery site came into view. Tall fences, guard towers, gates lit by floodlights. Dylan slowed, frowning. This wasn't some auto parts warehouse. This was something else entirely. His pulse quickened, and he gripped the wheel tighter. He had set out to close a chapter. Instead, it felt like he was about to open one he didn't understand at all. The rumble of the old Kenworth W slowed to a crawl as Dylan eased up to the gate. He had expected a warehouse dock, maybe a sleepy night guard to wave him in. Instead, he faced a chain-link barrier topped with razor wire, 2 Humvees parked at angles, and armed MPs in desert camouflage uniforms standing in the floodlight's harsh glow. His pulse hammered against his ribs. This wasn't a delivery for any auto parts company. The first soldier raised a hand. "Cut the engine." Dylan hesitated before turning the key. The growl of the W900 died, leaving an eerie stillness. Boots crunched on gravel as the soldiers approached. One of them, a tall man with a clean jawline and captain's bars on his collar, leaned up to the cab window. "Name?" "Dylan Mercer," he said, his voice thinner than he wanted. I'm delivering parts. Contract load. Picked it up from Mercer's garage." The captain's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "Mercer's garage," he repeated slowly. "Relation to Augustus Mercer?" Dylan's throat went dry. "He was my father. He passed away last week. I'm finishing the run he couldn't." The captain stepped back, motioned to the MPs. Within seconds, one climbed into the cab beside Dylan, hand resting close to his sidearm. "Follow the escort vehicle," the captain ordered. The gate clanged open. Dylan, heart hammering, drove through under watchful eyes. He wanted to turn around to explain this was all a mistake, but the Humvee ahead left no option. Inside, the facility was a maze of concrete hangars and low-lit bays. Soldiers worked in silence, their movements efficient, purposeful. Dylan parked where directed, his rig dwarfed by armored trucks with desert dust still clinging to their wheels. The captain appeared again, this time holding the manifest Dylan had left on the seat. This load was marked for restricted delivery. Only one person had clearance to bring it through. He lifted his gaze. "Augustus Mercer. So I'll ask you again. Who are you, and what are you doing here?" Dylan swallowed hard. "I told you, he was my dad. I'm just trying to honor him. One last job. That's all." The officer studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward a nearby bay. "Come with me." They entered a hangar that smelled of diesel and hot metal. Mechanics in fatigues swarmed over battered Humvees and armored transports, welding sparks dancing in the shadows. On a workbench lay components Dylan didn't recognize, gears, housings, things too heavy-duty for ordinary trucks. The captain stopped at a covered object in the corner. He pulled back the tarp to reveal an engine block, massive and scorched from heat. "Do you know what this is?" the captain asked. Dylan shook his head. "This is from a vehicle that shouldn't have made it back from Afghanistan. It did, because your father rebuilt the heart of it with parts he shouldn't have had." He let the words hang. "For years, Augustus Mercer ran repairs for us. Off the books. No pay, no recognition. Just results. He kept convoys moving when supply lines failed. You think he was a simple truck stop mechanic?" The hangar buzzed with torchlight and hammer strikes, but to Dylan it felt like standing inside a cathedral of steel. every soldier a silent witness to a truth his father had hidden. He staggered back, the words colliding with everything he thought he knew. His father, quiet, stubborn, bent over greasy carburetors, had been secretly working with the army? How? Why never tell his own son? "Why are you telling me this?" Dylan asked, his voice barely audible. "Because the load you brought," the captain said, pointing toward the trailer, "was more than nuts and bolts. Your father prepared critical components. He knew where they belonged, who needed them, and how to get them past red tape. His death left a gap. And now, by stepping behind that wheel, you walked into his world." Dylan shook his head. "No, that's not me. I don't know the first thing about engines. I can barely back a trailer into a dock." The captain's gaze softened just slightly. "Neither did most of the soldiers who counted on your father. But he showed up anyway." They walked back outside. Soldiers were unloading the trailer, carrying crates with care as though the metal inside mattered more than gold. Dylan leaned against the rig, trying to catch his breath. His entire life, he had thought of Gus as a man bound to one spot, a mechanic tethered to a garage, helping neighbors with busted radiators. Now he saw that same man's shadow stretching across continents and wars. "Why didn't he tell me?" Dylan muttered. The captain answered quietly, "Because it wasn't about recognition. Augustus Mercer knew that true service leaves no signature, only the footprints others follow. He kept you out to keep you safe. If you're smart, you'll walk away." Dylan stared at the ground, unsure whether to feel angry or proud. He had come here to honor his father with one last haul. Instead, he'd stumbled into a hidden chapter of the man's life, one laced with secrecy, sacrifice, and consequences Dylan didn't yet understand. The captain extended a hand. "Go home, Dylan. Grieve your father. This place will remember him long after the world forgets." "That's enough." Dylan shook the offered hand, his palm slick with sweat. He climbed back into the cab, engine rumbling to life again. As the gate closed behind him and the road opened ahead, Dylan realized nothing about this drive had been ordinary. His father's legacy wasn't just grease and wrenches. It was a lifeline for men and women who fought battles Dylan had only seen on the news. The headlights cut through the desert night. Dylan wondered if one last run had really ended, or if it had just begun. The morning of the funeral arrived gray and still, the kind of day that seemed to swallow sound. Dylan adjusted his tie in the cracked mirror of his bedroom, his hands clumsy against the stiff fabric. He had never liked formal clothes, and his father had never asked him to wear them. Gus preferred denim and grease-stained shirts, sleeves rolled up, work boots tied tight. Today, though, Dylan forced himself into the suit his aunt had pressed for him. At the churchyard, rows of folding chairs lined the patchy grass. A modest casket, draped in a plain white cloth, rested beneath the shade of an old oak. Dylan expected the small crowd that gathered early, family friends, neighbors from the diner, and a handful of truckers who nodded at him with weathered respect. Their presence comforted him. They were people who knew Gus the way Dylan had known him, as a mechanic who never said no when a man needed help. But then more arrived. First, it was a pair of men in pressed suits who introduced themselves as veterans. They carried themselves like soldiers, backs straight, eyes sharp, but they spoke softly as they shook Dylan's hand. Then came a group of riders on motorcycles, leather jackets patched with insignias of units Dylan didn't recognize. They formed a silent line near the back. An elderly woman, leaning on a cane, whispered to Dylan as she passed, "Your father once fixed my husband's convoy truck in the middle of a snowstorm. He made it home because of Gus." Dylan nodded numbly, his chest tightening. These weren't just neighbors. They were people bound by threads of a story he hadn't known existed until the night at the army base. The crowd kept growing, uniforms and faces he couldn't place, until the small-town service looked more like a gathering of old comrades. The service began quietly. The pastor spoke of integrity, of service to others without expectation of reward. Dylan listened, but his eyes kept drifting across the gathering. Men and women leaned forward as if hungry to testify, to tell the world what Gus had meant. One by one they did. A middle-aged man with a limp stood and cleared his throat. I drove out of Mercer's garage in '97 with a patched axle that should have left me stranded. 3 weeks later, that same truck was hauling aid supplies after a hurricane. If Gus hadn't fixed her up, hundreds would have gone hungry. His voice broke, and he sat down. A woman in fatigues, younger than Dylan, but with ribbons on her chest, spoke next. I never met Augustus Mercer face to face, but my commanding officer told us stories about a civilian mechanic who made sure broken-down transports never delayed a convoy. I'm here because soldiers like me survived thanks to work we never saw. Today, I pay respect to the man behind those stories. Dylan clenched his hands together, overwhelmed. He had thought he knew his father's world, confined to grease pits and the smell of diesel. But here were people who spoke of him like a lifeline, a quiet force holding their histories together. He realized the garage had been just the doorway. His father's real work stretched across highways, deserts, and war zones he'd never seen. The air shifted when the sound of engines rose in the distance. A black SUV, followed by 2 sedans, rolled up to the churchyard. Doors opened, and out stepped uniformed men in full dress. The hush was immediate, a silence that seemed to press against Dylan's skin. At the center of the group was a man who drew every eye without effort. Tall, broad-shouldered, his chest lined with medals that caught the dull light. A 4-star general. Dylan's breath caught. The general approached the casket slowly, his cap tucked under one arm, and saluted. The movement was precise, sharp, the kind of gesture that carried weight. When he lowered his hand, he turned to Dylan. "Are you his son?" the general asked. His voice was low but carried with authority. "Yes, sir," Dylan managed. The general studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Your father was more than a mechanic. He was a soldier without uniform, a guardian without title. When official systems failed, he made sure no one was left behind. The Army remembers men like that." From behind him, another officer stepped forward holding a folded American flag. The general accepted it, then placed it into Dylan's arms. The flag in his arms wasn't just fabric. It carried years of unspoken duty, pressed into him like a burden only his father had borne until now. "This flag is given on behalf of a grateful nation," the general said solemnly, "and on behalf of those who will never forget the roads your father kept open." Dylan's vision blurred, but he held his ground. Around him, the assembled veterans and strangers bowed their heads, some saluting, others pressing hands to hearts. The silence was complete, broken only by the rustle of leaves. In that moment, Dylan saw his father in a new light, not as the solitary mechanic bent under the hood, but as part of something vast. Every repaired axle, every welded frame, every long night under the garage lights had rippled outward, saving lives, carrying soldiers, keeping promises. When the service ended, people lingered. Some approached Dylan, sharing memories he had never heard. How Gus had worked through Christmas Eve to repair a transport that carried medical supplies. How he had once loaned his own tools to a unit short on equipment. How he never spoke of it, never sought recognition. Marlene from the diner found Dylan near the casket. Her eyes were red. "You see now, don't you? He wasn't just fixing trucks. He was holding people together." Dylan nodded, clutching the folded flag against his chest. "I thought I came here to bury my dad. Turns out, I'm just meeting him for the first time." The general approached once more as the crowd began to thin. He placed a firm hand on Dylan's shoulder. "Your father's work won't be forgotten, and neither will the son who carried his final mission through. When you drove that rig to us, you honored him more than you know." Dylan wanted to ask what that meant, what final mission his father had left him, but the words stuck in his throat. Before he could speak, the general gave a final nod and turned away, his entourage following. The black vehicles pulled off, leaving dust in their wake. Dylan stood rooted to the spot, the folded flag heavy in his arms, his father's legacy heavier still. He realized this story wasn't ending at the graveside. It was only beginning. The graveyard had emptied, but Dylan remained. The folding chairs were stacked, the casket lowered, the pastor gone. Only the oak tree whispered overhead, its branches shifting against a pale sky. Dylan sat on the cool grass, the folded flag resting in his lap. He traced its edges with his fingertips, as if the weight of cloth might yield answers his father had never spoken. He thought of the strangers who had come, bikers, veterans, soldiers in dress uniform. He thought of the general's words, "You honored him more than you know." They replayed in his mind like a riddle. He had finished one delivery, but the way people spoke, it felt as though Gus's final mission had only begun. A sound broke his thoughts, footsteps crunching on gravel. Dylan turned. The four-star general was walking back, this time without his entourage. Alone, he carried himself with less ceremony, his cap tucked under his arm, his face lined not just with age but with memory. "Mr. Mercer," he said quietly, lowering himself onto the bench near the oak. "I didn't want to leave without saying what should have been said years ago." Dylan blinked, unsure how to respond. "You already honored my dad more than anyone ever has." The general shook his head. "No, I honored his service. But you deserve to know why men like me showed up here today." The general leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Back in '03, a convoy in the desert was stranded. Our supply line had been chewed apart. Engines failing, parts shot. We should have lost those trucks. Then word came that a civilian mechanic in Missouri had somehow gotten parts into the system. Not through channels, not through paperwork. Just there when they were needed." He looked at Dylan, his eyes sharp. "That mechanic was your father. I never met him then, but his name reached me through the men who lived because their convoy rolled out again. Dozens of lives saved. Some of those soldiers came home, raised families, lived to see today, because Augustus Mercer refused to let a broken truck stay broken." Dylan gripped the flag tighter. "He never told me. Not once." "Of course he didn't," the general said softly. "Your father understood the kind of work he was doing. Off the books. Quiet. Not for recognition. If he spoke, he'd compromise not just himself, but those relying on him. His silence wasn't emptiness. It was protection. A barrier he built so you could live free of the weight he carried." Dylan's throat tightened. He remembered Gus coming home late, exhausted, sometimes with grease caked into his nails deeper than usual. He'd always assumed it was just another job for a neighbor, another long night at the shop. Now, every late return carried new meaning. The general reached into his pocket and withdrew a small envelope, weathered, sealed with the army insignia. He handed it to Dylan. "Your father left instructions with us before he passed. Said if you ever finished his last delivery, this was yours." Dylan stared at it, reluctant to break the seal. "What's inside?" "A letter," the general said. "And a contact. He wanted you to have the choice he never gave himself. To walk away or to step forward." Dylan turned the envelope in his hands. His father's handwriting scrawled across the front. "For Dylan, when the road calls." The sight of it stole his breath. He didn't open it, not yet. Some truths needed to wait until the noise of grief settled. They sat in silence for a while, the general giving him the dignity of space. Finally, the older man rose. He placed a firm hand on Dylan's shoulder, his grip strong, grounding. "Your father was a man of grit and humility," he said. "But he was also part of something bigger. Don't think of him as two men, the mechanic and the soldier. He was both, always, and he left you his story. What you do with it is up to you." With that, the general gave a final nod, his salute crisp and unwavering, before walking away toward the black sedan idling near the gate. The car door shut, the engine rumbled, and then he was gone, leaving Dylan beneath the oak with the letter and the folded flag. That night, Dylan returned to the garage. The shop felt different now, less like an empty shrine and more like a living map of his father's choices. Tools neatly hung on pegboards, jars of bolts labeled in Gus's cramped script. On the workbench sat an unfinished carburetor, a job Gus never got to finish. Dylan touched it, feeling the cold steel beneath his fingers. He unfolded a stool and sat where his father once had, the letter still sealed in his jacket pocket. He thought about the soldiers who had spoken, the strangers who treated Gus like kin. He thought about the captain at the gate, about the general story, about the lives that stretched forward because one mechanic refused to look the other way. Dylan didn't feel the weight of failure for not being his father's apprentice. Instead, he felt the weight of inheritance, not of skill but of responsibility. His dad hadn't needed him to be a mirror image. He had needed him to see. Dawn broke through the shop windows, painting the tools in amber light. Dylan finally tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet, his father's handwriting steady but faded. "Son, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't finish the last haul. You did it for me. Thank you. I never wanted this life for you, but I wanted you to know why I chose it. The bolts, engines, and trucks were just excuses. What really mattered were the lives waiting down the road. Families I'd never meet, but you might. If the call ever comes, you'll know what to do. Don't retrace my footsteps. Make your own path. Just remember, a life of service is the only road that truly leads somewhere." Dylan pressed the letter to his chest, eyes burning. He didn't know yet whether he would walk away or step closer. But he knew one thing. His father's legacy wasn't a secret anymore. The old rig outside gleamed faintly in the morning sun, as though waiting. And Dylan realized that some roads don't end at funerals. Some begin there. This story reminds us that some legacies aren't written in metals, but in the lives quietly saved along the way. If you were Dylan, would you want to follow in your father's hidden footsteps or leave the past buried? Share your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more powerful tales of honor and redemption. See you in the next video.